There we go.
All right, so move ahead, Rob.
All right. So let's see what we got here. Nope. There we go. All right. So one of the things that Visual Studio Code has that is, I think, pretty interesting is it has a lot of command line capabilities that you can use. So, most people know if you type in, just a code dot, it's going to open up Visual Studio Code in a new window with the current directory. That's what the dot's for, right? You can do other things. You can force a new window if you wanted to. So I have a file here called readme.md. And I already have another Visual Studio Code running. So if I click on this now, it's going to open up in that existing Visual Studio Code window. And I may not want to do that. I may want to say, no, I want a new window. So I can do that and with a -n. And now it opens up in a brand new window. And that's pretty cool. Not a real big deal. But some of the other things it can do is there is the ability to do diffs. So how many people have WinDiff on their system? You don't really need it. If you've got code, Visual Studio Code, you can issue a command that will show a diff. So this here, this is going to say, I want to open up a code. I want to open up a new window. I want to do a diff, and these are the two files I want to do a diff on. And if I click on that now, it opens up the window, and it shows me a diff. Oh, it just helps if I leave the window open on top there. So there you go. That's pretty cool. All right. And you can see these are two different things. They've got a couple changes in it, and it shows you all the differences. And you can go up and down between your differences, just like you would in WinDiff. It's pretty slick. Not bad for being built into that thing. You can use that, by the way, in Git if you want to use that as your Git diff tool. You can also, if you say, well, maybe you've got some utilities or something that will tell you, maybe you've got a problem on a file on a specific line, or maybe you're looking for log files and you want to open up at a specific place in the file, you can do that too. So, for example, in this case, I want to say, I want to open the README file on line 5 in column 45. And that's what the G is to go to, and the N, of course, is for a new window. So if I open this up, the cursor will be sitting at column 45 of line 5 right there. So it just opens it right up for me without a problem. Some weird stuff it can do. You can read from standard output into the input. So if you have a command line, for example, I'm just going to use this because it's easier to do it this way. If I say I want to echo hello world, I can use the code, and I don't think I need the exe on there. I'll take that off. Code and a dash, and it says, oh, read from input. So if I do this, if everything works correctly, it should open up, and there's hello world. So I echoed out hello world to code. So pretty slick. Then there's a whole bunch of other things you can do as far as command lines go, commands. And if you need to look up some, you can just do the help. Here's a whole bunch of them. And one of the ones that I find somewhat useful is the ability to list out my my extensions, so that you can list extensions out there and things like that. So, for example, you can do on it here. I can do list extensions, and it just lists the extensions. I don't have to open code up. It just goes in and looks to see what's there, and it just gives me the list. So without actually having to open up code, there you go. So there's a whole bunch more you can do. And like I said, if you use the help, that's the best way to do it. So there you go. Back to you, Bill.
Is Bill muted?
Bill might be muted.
Sorry about
Well,
that.
that many people hope for that. So I was thinking, are you still?
I'm
We
here.
hear you now.
Getcha. Okay. So Rob, the command line is so 1990s.
It is,
Um,
but it's coming back.
It looks good on you. It looks very useful. I do applaud your use of the new Windows 10 terminal,
Yes.
and you'll be showing that in the July lab. So, you know, that was fairly interesting. Okay, let me see if I can get a Visual Studio Code window shared, and we can go into my part of the presentation. I think this is the window we want. So, a lot of good stuff built into Visual Studio Code. You'll notice that I'm using the Insiders Edition, and that is a nightly build. I don't install it every day, but you get the changes a little bit quicker than the general public. It's sort of interesting to keep track of all this and help test and give feedback to the product team. Did you know that Visual Studio Code just had its 5-year anniversary? It was released in 2015, but it dates much further back. It started in 2011 when Microsoft hired this guy from, I think, Switzerland, and he was one of the ones that worked on a Java tool, Eclipse, and they brought him into Microsoft, and he started designing the architecture for what is eventually Visual Studio Code. And it took them 2 or 3 years to build an online editing experience. Some people may know that as Monaco. That was the code name for it. And then that was released in 2015. And when they first released code, it did not support extensions. They added the extension. They had already designed them, but they actually added those in months or, probably 6 months later. And what's very interesting, the way Visual Studio Code does extensions is that they all run in their own memory process so that an extension can't crash Visual Studio Code on itself. It's much safer. So that is very useful. Now, a lot of the features built into Visual Studio Code are actually part of extensions. So if you look on the left-hand side of your nav, there's a cute graphic here called extensions. So if we go Control-Shift-X, that would actually take us to extensions. And you'll see that there are a number of extensions listed. Now, Rob just showed you a way to list these from the command line. But since he showed that, I'm going to open up my terminal window, just another command line, and I'll show you that mine doesn't work. And then I'll explain why. Darn. The reason is, if you are using the Insiders version of code, you have to say Code Insiders. That's an interesting tip. So over here, we have a bunch of extensions. There's a lot of them. Did you know that you can do all sorts of clever listing here? You can say, show me the installed extensions. It seems I have more than a couple. You can show the outdated ones. I keep my stuff up to date, so that's not an issue. These are the ones that are enabled. These are the ones that are disabled, and so on and so forth. If you're more, did you notice up here, there's like a little search box? If you start with an @ sign, this is a clever trick, it actually comes up and says, what do you want to look at? Well, I want to look at the installed extensions. You just hit enter and it shows you what you want. So that's sort of interesting. Now, when you use the ellipsis, it also allows you to sort. So I really want to know which one is the most popular. So I'm going to sort by install count. And apparently Python is by far the most used extension. But you also get an inference here of how to use the sorting structure. So in this case, I'm sorting by install. I could install by, I think you can sort by date. So if you're command line oriented, you would use that approach. There's also a thing called tags. So if I go here and I say @tag, what I can do is I'm going to search for only extensions that provide code snippets. And these are extensions that do code snippets. And so on and so forth. So pretty interesting stuff. The other thing that you would want to know from this menu is that you can check for updates. When you do that, it comes up in my case and says all of my extensions are up to date. So I'm happy with that. And then I can go in here and I can tell it whether I want to do auto updating. I leave mine on so they all update themselves. And then I can disable all extensions. I guess there's some reason you'd want to do that. I don't know what it is. But pretty interesting that you can use the menu and the search here to find anything you want. And a good example, we're going to look later at some Azure stuff. If I click Azure, you can see how many different Azure extensions there are. Right now, last count, there are in probably around 22,000 extensions. And yes, you can write your own. So the last thing I'm going to show you is there's a thing called built-in. And this is an interesting concept. Did you know that certain things that you take for granted, like the ability to use GitHub, the ability to use HTML, the ability to JavaScript debug, all of those are actually added to the product as extensions. In fact, all the programming languages are extensions. So when they developed the architecture for VS Code, they made it completely extensible, and then they used that to build in really important stuff like the ability to work with C#, the ability to work with TypeScript, F#, etc. And then finally, the other thing that's built in are your themes. So they actually come as part of the product, and then you can, of course, download additional themes. So, Rob, what do you think about extensions?
I love extensions. I use a lot of them. But I do, when I have my extensions open, have it a little bit bigger so I can see the icons for the extensions. Not that.
You mean like that?
Yes.
Well, that would probably be a lot more interesting if I got rid of the built-in.
Yes.
And I could, oh my God, look at those pretty pictures.
Yes. It's a lot easier for me to see that than it is to read little text.
There you go. All right, now, your turn.
My turn. All right. All right, let's see what we got here. Got to find the right screen. I think it's this one. Oh, good. I got the right one. Let me switch that again. Hang on a second. Let me change that because I don't need anything but the actual code window. If I could find where the damn code window. Ah, there it is. That looks better, right? There we go. All right. So this is just some text here. Some of the things that one of the things that I really like about Visual Studio Code, which I think does actually, I think Visual Studio Code does a lot of things better than Visual Studio. One of the things I think it does better is the ability to have multiple cursors. And everybody sort of knows, you know, you could sit here and I can just use Control-Alt-Shift and I can come down here and I can start typing, and this is the beginning of the line. And as I type, you know, it types on every single line, right? That's pretty cool. That's you know, that's pretty standard these days. One of the things that it can also do is I can click and use the Alt key while I'm clicking, and I can put the cursors in a lot of different spots. And I can, you know, start editing in each of those spots if I wanted to. That's pretty slick. Not all together, but just all wherever you want them to be, right? There are a few special commands. So if I do a Alt-Shift-I, I can put, and this one this one is useful, especially if you do coding that needs something at the end of a line. So all these lines are different lengths, and a lot of times you have to go to the end of the line on each line, and they're in different spots and stuff like that. So Alt-Shift-I will put the cursor, if I do it right here. I actually have to select something first. There we go. Alt-Shift-I. It helps if you use Shift and not Control. And of course, there. So you select the.
You could put a semicolon on each line?
I could put a semicolon on each line just by doing that. So there you go. So that I find very useful. That it's you have to select a selection first, then it's Alt-Shift-I, and it will it'll do that. You can also
we did get a woohoo for that.
Oh well, thanks. That's pretty good. I get a woohoo, Bill. There's also I can put the cursor at a matching selection. So if I do a Control-Shift-L, then my cursor was at the beginning of the word line. So it selected every word that was line on the file. So then I can start, editing if I wanted to. So that's cool. So those are some of the multiple cursor capabilities that are built into Visual Studio Code that I find very useful in my daily coding work. So there. What do you think?
How would you ever remember all those keystrokes? Is there a guide for all the keystrokes?
There is a guide for all the keystrokes.
Well, where might that be, Rob?
Well, you can, if you want to, go to keyboard shortcuts right here. So I clicked in the little gear in the bottom left and keyboard shortcuts. Or if you know the keyboard shortcut, it's Control-K, Control-S. So if I click on that, it will open it up. Now, this will also let me edit them if I wanted to. So if I wanted to come in here and change what, Control Insert does, I can change that to something different.
So
if
you happened upon a coworker's open editing session, you could really do some clever things here.
You could. Not that you'd really probably want to, but you could. And if there are keyboard shortcuts that come with the extensions, they would also show up here. So I have most of my keyboard shortcuts turned off, or most of my extensions turned off. But if there are some, they would show up here as well. So there you go. So it's right there. It's really easy to discover this stuff. And then there's also the key maps, which does this stuff, which shows you what you can use as extensions for your key map. So there you go. That's something Bill showed a little bit about with the ability to put little stuff up here and get things. So they have some of this stuff is right there built in.
Well played, Rob. And for those of us that are my age, I get a little bit of a tear right now remembering WordPress.
Yeah.
Because you were really cool if you knew the keystrokes to like select a word or delete a word.
Yes.
You mean WordPerfect, don't you?
Thank you, Chris. You're right. I don't know why I said WordPress. It's just.
I go back to WordStar, so there you go. That's even worse.
WordPerfect is way back. Yeah, that was the galactic version. So.
Yes. So just to give you a little pointing here that you've got emulators, keyboard shortcuts for things like Vim. For those of you who like that, there's an EMAP scheme mapping. So if that's what you're into, you can use this.
Fascinating.
Yes. So there you go.
Well, that was fun. Well, it's time for me to come back and play with extensions some more. So you're going to find my whole presentation is all about extensions. And I think that's where the real magic is. Of course, the base editing, got to know it. But once you conquer that, there is just so much that you can do with extensions. So we're just going to do some really, really simple stuff here. Let's take a look at this. If I do categories formatters, and in the formatters, let's sort by install count, you'll see that there are some popular formatters here that are sort of specific to certain languages. And you can also format them by ratings and stuff like that. I sorted by rating. I wanted to go by install count. There we go. Okay. So there is one called Prettify. It's in here somewhere. I guess I could just search for it. And that's one that I think a lot of people use. And then I'm also going to show you two others that I play with a little bit for various reasons. So VS Code icons is one I like. That's this one. And another one I'm going to is 4 to 2, and I'll explain what that does in a few minutes. All right, so this is VS Code icons, and this one's very popular. You'll see that it has 5.3 million uses or downloads, and it's got a rating of 5. When I click on an extension, typically what it's going to do is open up a screen or a page that explains about the extension. So you get some important stuff, like at the top, you get how many people have downloaded it, stars, ratings, and you can rate it yourself. You can click here and that will go right to the GitHub repository. I'm not going to do that because I'm going to limit my presentation to VS Code for the time being. And then down below here, they have a little Markdown file where they can have some nice documentation. And you'll notice that here, they're actually showing you a looping video that shows you the value of their extension. So that's very useful. If I scroll down a little more, usually the instructions for installation are here, some security notes, features, etc. And then most of these things are open source, so they tell you how to contribute, where the GitHub repository is, and who the main people are, and what kind of license they're using. So that's pretty standard stuff. The other thing that you might want to be aware of is feature contributions. So what this shows you is what the extension actually adds to the Visual Studio environment. So in this case, this is adding a bunch of settings, and these are settings about whether or not I want to hide folders or show the folder path or show the file icon. Down a little further, these are commands. The commands are the things that you use up at the top of the screen when you go to the command palette. So for instance, if I go to up here and I say VS, and again, I spelled it wrong. If I say VS Code, there's icons activate. So that's actually what that command is. And that will tell me whether I'm going to use the icons or not. So that's all documented in the contributions section. And then finally, there's, of course, your change log that tells you how many versions. And this is a good example of an extension that is constantly updated. And they keep adding new graphics and things on an ongoing basis, probably a couple every month or two. Now, what does this darn extension do? Well, if we were to actually have some code, it would be a lot more interesting. So let's open a project. Let's see if we have anything interesting here. This is something I worked on called Razor Country. And in here, what you're going to see is very colorful icons for all of the different objects. And if you're not used to seeing this level of detail on your icons, I strongly recommend you add this extension. It doesn't cost anything. Just to show you the difference, what would happen if we disabled this? Well, let's go to our extensions, and we'll go to icons, and there's VS Code icon, and let's disable this. So we're going to disable this, and we have to do a quick reload. Once it reloads, we get our default icons, which are not nearly as colorful. You can see here the folders don't have colors, and you can sort of see some basic stuff like, you know, this is a project file, this is a CS, but that's sort of the, you know, the garden variety icons. It's much more interesting to get the colorful ones. So again, going back to VS Code icons, if we enable that again, well, what we could have done actually, a smarter way to show you this, if I say, show me what things I have disabled, you'll see that VS Code icons is disabled. And all I need to do is enable that again. And once I do, I go back and look at my code, and you'll see that all my folders have attractive icons. In fact, if you watch very carefully, when I close the folder, the icon is different from when it's open. The level of detail is exquisite. Other things, I use Prettify a lot because you want your code to at least look pretty. So let's see if we can find that one. And I think that's the one. And what that does is that one of the things it does is enables or disables the formatter. So when you have some source code, then if you actually go in and look at your code, you can do stuff like decide whether or not you want it formatted or not. You click the little command on the bottom. And the reason I'm showing you that is that an extension can add things to the command line at the bottom or the status bar at the bottom, as well as to the command palette. So if we do the command palette and we do prettier, we could, in this case, that makes a configuration file. Now, normally what we do when we format, you just Control-KF will format your text a certain way. And you'll notice that mine's a little annoying. I just spent 6 months working on a course for ASP.NET Core for a company called Code Academy. And the requirements is I had to submit all the code with a 2-space indent because it fits nicer on their screens. And what I did is just, you know, if I mess this one up and I mess this one up, there's another extension that I have, and it's called for2. And see this one right here? Convert indentation from tab to 4 spaces. And when I click on that, it actually will clean up the formatting a little bit. And of course, I wanted to. But what that did is it indented everything 2 spaces consistently. And I found that extension, and that was able, saved me a lot of time because I was able to make all the code comply with the publisher's requirements, and saved me a ton of work. So
that second extension, do you have the name of that, or in the extensions dialog, can we see it?
The second one I showed?
Yeah, not prettier, but is it 2-space, 4-space, or maybe a different one?
Yeah, hold on. Let's try category formatters. You'd think. Trying to remember
If you can't find it, I happen to find one that's called 2-4-, but I just wasn't sure if it was the same one.
Yeah. There's so many. Well, if I look at my installed ones, that should tell me a little bit better.
Because 4-2 is in there. It's right at the top.
There it is. Indent 4 to 2.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Does everybody see that? Indent 4 to 2. And it's pretty well rated. But that, again, if you have a requirement like that, go for it. So, all right, over and out.
Well, that was pretty cool. So, you mentioned you could write your own, Bill, but did you say how to write your own?
This is time for real men work. Show me.
I didn't do it. I'm just asking if you did it. But you would use Typescript. That's the language of Visual Studio Code that they like you to use. And there's a whole tutorial on the Visual Studio Code website of how to set up your own extension.
Excellent.
Yeah, works pretty well. I was playing around with it a little bit. So there you go. Nice. Now, I like fonts. You like fonts, Bill?
Sometimes.
Wrong one. Hang on a second. That's not what I want to show. I like fonts. Where is it? Oh, I must have missed.
I like the font for your shirt there with Perkium and Valley.
You like that? That's pretty nice.
Go for it.
All right. So, and I like ligatures on my fonts. You know what ligatures are?
I don't know.
Oh. All right. Well, that's when you take multiple characters and you make them into one. Okay?
Ooh.
Pretty cool. So, Visual Studio Code does take ligatures. In fact, it does, again, a better job than Visual Studio does in handling ligatures. So I'm going to go into settings, which you can get to from the little gear here. You go to settings, and here's the settings. And I'm going to search for fonts. And my fonts in my text editor, this is the current one I'm using for one that has ligatures. It's called, I don't know how to pronounce that, Fire Code or something like that. And it has a lot of ligatures. And if you go online and you go to the GitHub repository for this, you will see all the things it can do. It's really cool. But some of the things I don't like it to do, and this is, if I use this in Visual Studio, regular Visual Studio, I don't get a choice to fine tune my fonts. But in this I do. So there's this other section here called font ligatures. Now, if I go in here, it's not as nice as this settings that you see. It actually shows you the JSON that are part of the settings. So here are the settings that are specific to what I'm doing. There's the editor font family. You don't have to change this. You can do that right in the other setting. But this font ligature thing here is something you might want to add. And these are exceptions. And you have to go on their site and the GitHub repository. You can find out what the exceptions are. And I can probably get rid of these, and then I can put them back. But for right now, let's just take a look and see what it is when I'm doing fonts. So, if you have an if statement, if whatever, not equal, right? And it puts that kind of thing in there.
Ooh.
Pretty slick, huh? If you do an arrow, it actually makes an arrow. It's pretty nice.
You're gonna get another woohoo for this.
There's a lot of neat little ligature formats that it can do, and if I can bring up the site for that, let me just do that real quick. I know you can't see it right now, but I'll move to it in a second. And yes, so let's switch over to that guy. Give me a second. So here are a lot of the fonts that you get. So you can see you've got like your colon equals gets smushed together a little bit. Plus plus gets turned into what looks like a single character. All those things are in here. And here are some of the more extensive lists of things. Markdown, this is pretty cool where, you use a lot of hashes in the Markdown and it sort of smushes them all together. Nicely done. Lines it can put into there, equals, it makes different equals. So if you have triple equal sign, it makes 3 lines instead of just 2. There's some other ones it does. So some of the ones I don't like. So if we come down here, yes, this thing goes on and on and on. This guy has really put a lot into it. So I don't like when the greater than or equals to looks like this, because to me that makes it look kind of funny. I like this style. So I turn on SSO2 in my settings. So this is where you get that information from. Right. I also like this kind of 0 instead of this kind of 0, little things like that. And there's a couple other things I do. I like the ampersand, the traditional ampersand is in there as well. So this is where you go, and you can, like I said, go into your settings, and let me open that back up again so we can see that. And if we go into settings and the settings JSON file, you can see here are those things I turned off or set the flags for to let me see things the way I want to see them instead of the way that it wants me to see them. So that's pretty slick. And there are a lot of fonts out there with ligatures. This happens to be my favorite because it is so extensive and has so many things in it. There's another one based off of source code. I use source code as my my normal font that does not use ligatures. And there's one that's a fork of source code that has ligatures in it too. There's a whole bunch of them out there. And you just come in here and you can turn all that stuff on and turn it off. And that's why I like fonts. So, sorry, greater than or equal to turns into that, all those things. It's pretty slick. It, to me, makes the reading of my C# code much easier because I'm not doing a lot of thinking about things like not equals. I can just see that it's a not equal sign, not don't have to worry about the 2 characters and the things that don't look right to me. So that's pretty slick. And the settings themselves, there are a ton of settings, and they did a really nice job. When this first came out, the only way to work with settings was in that JSON file, and every setting was in there. It was almost impossible to figure out what you wanted to do. And now you've got this nice little interface for settings, and you can come in here and look at the diff editor and look at different features, different extensions. And by the way, when you add extensions, going back to your bill, when you add extensions, they can add their own settings to the system. So if you go into settings, you can see, for example, this is an extension I have. Here's some things that I can modify and make it work more to my liking. So that's the other thing with settings. So there you go. That's fonts and settings.
Very impressive. You are certainly a font of knowledge. But my next demonstration can put this argument to rest.
All right.
And I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code. And suppose I told you one of my favorite extensions is called RestClient.
Yeah, mine too.
And RestClient allows you to do HTTP requests with all sorts of options. And look at all the things it does. A lot of stuff. And what does it mean, RestClient? Well, a lot of you probably use a tool like Fiddler or Postman to test your APIs or to debug issues with running applications. And what's really nice about this, you either have a file with the extension .http or .rest. And of course, since I'm using the fancy VS Code icons, if I go and look at mine, they actually have a special icon just for HTTP files. Very clever they are. Now, some people like to be command line driven. So control, if I am in here and I do Control Alt R, it actually runs my request. And what I just did there is I did a get to this address, and this happens to be an open API for a company that called lineups.com. It's a website. And guess what? This has every one of the players in the NFL. So this happens to be just the Eagles, but you can get all like 2,300 players this way. And it has ridiculous detail. If I do a search here, I can go down to Fletcher Cox and see that he is number 91. He's been in the league probably around 32 years. But that's all his specifics, height, weight, and stuff like that. So that's pretty useful. So basically, you can use this to test APIs. That's sort of cool. Now, when you run these APIs, let's go try another one. So this is a REST client, and I did lineups. There's one called country. And in country, I'm showing that I can have multiple tests on one file. I separate them with 3 pound signs. So here, when I do a send request, that's going to get you a list of countries in the world. But little old-fashioned, you may recognize this as XML. And it displays it okay. If I were to send the request and include the format equals JSON, then I get the same data in a more familiar pattern. Now, the other thing I will point out is that this has extensive metrics applied to it. If you go down to the lower left-hand corner, an extension can write to the status bar. And when I just ran that request, see the request up here, the tab says 198 milliseconds. Well, if I hover over the 198 milliseconds, and I don't think you can see this because I'm limiting my window. Let me see if I can trick Teams into showing this to you. There you go. Okay, so when I hover over that, it actually shows me, you know, how long did DNS take, how long did the request take, how long did it take to download, and then it also shows me the size in header and also body. So very useful statistics, and if you do a lot of API work, I think this is extremely useful for you to document and also test. And incidentally, you can take these files and you can run the entire file, so you can use it as sort of like an automated test bed. Now, the third example I have, of course, is COVID. So if we go here, this one shows all the states and their COVID statistics as of today. So see, last updated 6/10, and this is Alabama, and they're up to 22,000 cases. And then it tells you, like, you know, how many they've had in the last couple of days, so you can see trending, stuff like that. This one shows just the United States. So we're just showing the important numbers for today. And then this one shows the US history. And if I click on that one, that actually shows me a history over time. I could take this graph and show all those nice graphs that you see on the news and a lot of us follow to see how this is going. The last thing I'll show you with the REST client is a real world example of work that I'm doing for a client. In my day job, I do a lot of work on human resource websites. I work with hundreds of them, for very large companies. And if I go to translate, now this one is a little fancier. Here I'm actually hitting cognitive services in Azure. And this has a really, really long URL. I'm not going to show the whole thing to you because then I would have to expose my subscription key, which is tucked away a little bit to the right. But this shows an example of a more complex request that is a post instead of a get. It requires certain headers, and it requires a body. So you just script the body right here in the request. And we're going to send the text, Black Lives Matter. It's all over the news. And when we send that to Azure, watch what happens. Did you know that, I don't even know what ID is. I don't remember some of these. This is one of the Chinese variants. So that's how you say Black Lives Matter in Chinese. This is the other Chinese variant. And then coming down here, here's Netherlands, France, Deutsche, Hungarian, Italian, Japanese. But I actually have to do this work because some of the websites I work on are in like 10 or 12 different languages. And I make tools that allow the users to see the content in like English and the targeted language. So I use this to develop the basic prototype, and you got to love RestClient, one of my favorites.
One of mine too. And it can also do curl requests. And at the top there of your, on the right-hand side, if you, I think you have to scroll all the way to the top. I'm not sure what's showing up there, but basically you can just get rid of that Cox thing.
Yeah, I have to go to the top.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, I can save them.
Yep, which is pretty cool, I think.
Excellent.
I use this all the time, use the RestClient. All right, so I got one more I think I can show. And it's going to be leading us into next time we get together. But we'll show this little teaser right now. How's that sound? So let me open this guy up. All right. Now, I have, this does require an extension. I will say that. But we're going to use the command line for this extension to work. There is an extension you should all get called Remote Developer. It's an extension pack. It gives you a whole bunch of stuff. This is from Microsoft. Gives you a whole bunch of stuff for doing development work in Docker containers or in Linux machines, or you can SSH into different machines. You can do a whole bunch of stuff through Visual Studio Code using that extension. And that's a very important one you should get. And one of the things that lets you do is do some weird things, like, for example, this command, assuming it's going to work for me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to open up code, but I'm going to open it up in my Ubuntu WSL, and I'm going to go to the home/rob directory and open that up. And what's going to happen if everything works the way it's supposed to is that we are now opening a Linux container or Linux version of Visual Studio Code, and it's connecting to it now. It's starting up. You can see it's starting up WSL, unpacking Visual Studio Code because it has to do that because it's sort of done on the fly. And then this other little thing you see down here, opening remote, that's how you know you're on a remote machine. So I don't know if you've seen it on my Windows here. There's a little green box in the bottom left-hand corner, and that tells me where I'm opening things up from. For the most part, it's on Windows, but this case, it's now in my Linux container or my Linux Windows subsystem for Linux, my Ubuntu version of this. And there it is, and that's my bash RC file. So I can go in here and I can edit it. And yes, it understands it's running in Linux. And it says, yeah, no problem. I understand line endings correctly. I can do all that stuff. And when I save it back out to my WSL. And I could open up all sorts of things here. So this is just a little view into what we're going to be talking about next time, is this kind of thing here. So that's pretty slick, I think. What do you think?
Excellent use of foreshadowing.
Yes, there you go.
So a little unrelated to what you just showed, but having to do with Visual Studio Code, we did get a question from our good friend Z-Man13 Philly. The question is, have you guys ever set up multiple projects in a solution to debug at once in VS Code like you can in Visual Studio? Example, a Web API project plus Angular React.
Absolutely. Couldn't demonstrate that in the next 4 minutes, but yes, absolutely. There are some really good tutorials. If you go to Microsoft Docs /learn, if I remember doing one tutorial that was about making APIs in Visual Studio Code. And I remember doing that one, and it had a front-end project and a back-end for the APIs. And then it showed you how to debug on both.
Yeah, are you thinking about when you add a project to a solution with .NET New? I'm just wondering if we're both thinking the same thing, because I was gonna.
You mean workspaces or?
Yeah, and also, you know, the questioner too. You can open VS Code and with a solution, and
Yep.
it does handle both projects in a similar way to VS Code. And then if you're saying to yourself, well, how would you get that done in the first place? There is a .NET New SLN command that will add projects, and I was just going to link that documentation in the chat. That may not be exactly what he's asking, so if you have a follow-up, let us know.
There's
Hey,
also an extension for solutions that you can add in so that it will make it look like Visual Studio
Nice.
as well. So
So much of this
Fair
by
enough.
extension, huh?
yes,
Indeed. So the way it sounds, we may want to have an additional lab, maybe in two months or so, and spend the whole time doing more complex debugging and I think GitHub integration, because there's so much you can do with this tool.
yep.
And it would be great to show people some heftier projects that had multiple, browser windows open, talking to each other at the same time.
Right. Yeah,
All
I
right.
did. I left off the GitHub and the Git integration that's built in to Visual Studio Code because of time. But yes.
Understood. So I'm going to jump into the world of, there's two more things I want to show you if I have time. And I'm going to show you Azure Functions. So Azure Functions, there are a whole slew of extensions that Microsoft has written to allow you to get work done in Azure very quickly. And the automation that's provided here is exceptional. And what this does, if you go in, one of the first things you would do is you would sign in. So if you have Azure Functions enabled, what you're going to see on the left-hand side is a little, it almost looks like a tent, but that is your Azure button. And when you click on that, it's going to come up here, and it's going to ask you if you want to make a new function, things like that. And you would select a subscription. Now, something down here is not wired up correctly. So what I would do is go in here, and I would say Azure sign in. And what it did is it actually took me to a different browser window, which you're not seeing, but that's supposed to get me into Azure, and then I'm supposed to be able to select a subscription. Not working right now. We don't have time to go into the details, but I wanted to show you some of what would be useful. So what I'd want to do here is I would want to basically create a new project. So you could go up here and you would say HTTP, whoops. I think I have to create a project first. I'll just do that. Create new project, yep. And let's just call this Azure Test 22. Seems like a great folder name. It's 222 now. It's okay. All right, so basically what I did is I clicked on this little doohickey that comes as part of the extension that says create a function. I want to do this in C#. Then it says, what do I want to do? I'm going to do an HTTP trigger, and I'll call it my trigger. And we're going to make this a company function, and we're going to make it a function. And let's open this in the current window. And what it does is it actually, it basically works like templates, and it creates a project with a template. And if you go and look at the code here, you'll see that it has a host JSON file, and that has a bunch of settings in it, how you want to connect, how you want to send your request. And then it has a CS file it writes for you, and basically it has the framework of a function. And once you have this built out, then what you can do is you can go look at it, and the extension actually shows you your functions here. And if you do a build, I'll see if I can do a quick build. Hello. So it basically compiles all this code and gets it ready to push up to Azure. And once you do that, you can actually see your functions, and it writes down your, this is actually something that is built into Azure. But if you have all this working, you can actually go and deploy, see it's deploying this to Azure right now. And I could actually go and test it. We don't have time to show you that, but there's a lot of very useful stuff like that if you're into Azure development. Almost any of their programming things like bots and functions and database things are all automated and scripted now in Visual Studio extensions. So that's an example of automating the build of some resource for Azure. The last thing I'll show you, I know that we're just at 2 or 3 minutes over, and this is going to be a review of what we went through last meeting. And that extension, and let's just go and, well, let's do this. So I'm going to click on Remote Explorer, and the extension I'm going to use is actually called Code Spaces. So Code Spaces is in preview. And you'll see up here the little orange badge. It says it's in preview. This is the new capability to actually run a code space, which is an environment running in Azure in a container, but the code and the debugging is actually local to your machine running Visual Studio Code. And they are using the capabilities of VS Code to do remoting to make this work. The advantage of this is that you don't have to install all the software. You don't have to install databases on your own laptop. All you need is VS Code. You connect to a code space, and your company can set up multiple code spaces and have all your projects organized with GitHub integration. It goes very smooth. So just to show you an example of this, we're running code spaces. If I click on remote here, you'll see that I already have some code spaces, and I'll show you an example of one. I have a sample VS Code environment. So I'm going to click this little electric plug. And on the right-hand side, it shows me a status. And what it's doing is it's actually connecting to the container. Technically, it's a Kubernetes container running in with a Linux environment. And if it connects to that correctly, it will tell me that shortly.
Yeah, I love code spaces. I'm a huge fan of both developing up in Azure and also locally, and works in a browser.
To me, this is development for the future.
Yep.
Everybody should be going in this direction. So just to reiterate, the source code here is actually stored on the container, and the debugging happens on the container. All we're getting in Visual Studio Code is a remote view into the development environment in that container in the cloud. Now, since it's in Azure, there are costs involved. But if you have a real development shop, you want to get developers started up quickly, time is money, this is an excellent way to go. Notice how it automatically knows all my extensions. It knows I have my fancy fonts and icons and things like that. And if I go here and actually look some of the source code, it says, hello, Bill from VS Online. And I'll call this Philly.bill, make it like Philly.net, if I can actually figure this out. And what I'll do here is I will run this with an F5. Now, what gets real interesting here is that we're actually debugging, but this is running in the cloud. And I already had a breakpoint set. It came up here, and it knows that I'm going to be on port 3000. It knows I'm going to be localhost. So if I were to go to, where is the darn thing? If I were going to go to that particular port and stuff, I could connect and actually run that and show that to you. I don't have a browser window here, but you would actually see if I ran that, it ran and it showed my name up there, which is terribly exciting. This is just a little JavaScript thing running in Node.js, but you can run full applications, C#. You can run Blazor. You can do just about any Microsoft-based development in this fashion. Take the time to look at code spaces. It's well worth your investment to learn about it.
Yeah.
By the way, code spaces, what I'm showing you right here is in preview, and I'm still on the waiting list to get the next fancy version. So by all means, go to the Code Spaces website, sign up, and you'll be able to test some of this on your own.
And you can see your remote because the bottom left corner is green with the information about the fact that you're remote there.
Indeed, I am. It's green is our color for the day.
Yes.
So, all right.
All right.
You know, I could have showed you this more clearly had I skipped over the breakpoint.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it tunnels through to the Azure container and makes you feel like you're bringing it up locally.
Well, let's end with that,
Yep.
Chris. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch. Let me switch and show you my browser. That's actually the window that it opened up in my browser, and that's what it showed me. And notice that it's my local browser, localhost, even though I'm running the application in a container in Azure. It's a fascinating way to work.
Yep. And no more onboarding document, no more going around to your team and saying, how do you set up your computer again? Because it's a container that everyone shares, and it doesn't have to be Microsoft stuff. Just for fun, I built a container to do programming with Elixir, which is based on Erlang, put it up in code spaces. It works. So it's any Docker-based environment you want attached to it in VS Code or in a browser. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and we're going to probably set up some hands-on labs for our Philly.net community and actually run them using this technology. We just need to get a little more familiar with it ourselves. all brand new, just introduced a build.
Yep.
Okay, so to end the night, this is our next lab. It's the since July has 5 Wednesdays. Our next lab will be the second Wednesday right after Independence Day, and we're going to talk about some really interesting new features. If you are into cross-platform development, this will be the session for you. We're going to talk to you about how to use Terminal on Windows 10, and that has all sorts of new capabilities. This is the Windows subsystem for Linux. You can run Linux on your Windows 10 machine without a virtual machine. The Windows subsystem, of course, has a bash shell, which is basically your command line environment for Linux. And then we'll finish off the hour with a demonstration of PowerShell and show why that scripting language is gaining a lot of popularity even in the Linux marketplace.
All right.
And next week we're back with Brian. Is that right?
Yes, I'll be happy to display that. And Brian, as we mentioned, Brian Minissi, really strong on DevOps and application automation. And he is going to show us, you probably have heard of this before, Terraform, a very popular scripting language for automation. And ARM is a scripting language that's part of Azure. It stands for Azure Resource Manager. So he's going to compare and contrast those. If you've never seen it, this is the logo for Terraform.
I use Terraform all day long. Fun stuff.
All right.
Chris,
All right. Cool
close
stuff.
it out.
Yep. So let's see. Real quick
Can you
here.
promote the stream, promote your talk tonight, things like that.
Yeah, so anyways, thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks for giving us an extra 15 minutes of your time. The next stream is next week, next Wednesday, 7 p.m. U.S. Eastern. There is no Dev Talk Show tonight, but the Dev Talk Show is at 8:30 p.m. Wednesday nights, but we're just not able to get together tonight, so we'll be back on our schedule there. But hey, everybody, thank you for joining us here at Philly.net, and don't forget, next Wednesday, June 17th, you saw Brian Minissi, some awesome infrastructure automation as code with Terraform and ARM, and we will see you then. Don't forget to join us, and thanks for everything. You can always watch these archives at youtube.com/PhillyDotNet. Have a good night.
Good night.